Okay. I'm going to give it just a couple more minutes, because I believe there are a few more people that are going to attend. If we can just hold on, and I'll get kicked away in about 2 minutes. Righto, so may as well get started. So for Tam in Brisbane, thanks for joining us. I'm Michael Rogers. I'm the presenter today, and I'm Safety and Technical Advisor with Master Electricians Australia. We were asked by the Platinum Head Office to put something together on safe work method statements, because there is quite a lot of confusion in the industry around them, and a lot of jargon and a lot of misinformation that sort of gets around some of the building sites. So hopefully this presentation will clear some of that up today. I expect it to run for about half an hour. And any questions, if you see down on the bottom right corner, if you just put any questions in as we go, they'll all be logged, and I'll try to circle back to them at the end, but there is a fair bit of content to get through. Thank you. Righto, so let's get started. So in today's session, we're going to cover some of the regulator concerns around safe work method statements, some industry jargon, and try and get that cleared up. Definitions from the regulations that are important in the use of safe work method statements, legislative requirements for SWMS, some basics of safety management, and then where SWMS fit in the overall role of providing safe systems of work, which will be one of the definitions that we'll go into a little bit later, and a sample of the MEA SWMS that we'll review at the very end, and just show how the various elements in a safe work method statement fit together. So regulator concerns. I spend a lot of time with regulators primarily in New South Wales and the ACT over the last couple of years. There's a lot of concerns about and how they're being used, and a lot of improvement notices being issued to both head contractors and subcontract electricians. So first of the concerns is that SWMS are being prepared by people who are not in a position to assess the high risk work carried out. That is back office staff. They're very aware of that, and that generic SWMS are not being reviewed and updated for specific business requirements. That's a real problem, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. There's some examples of people having SWMS for diving work in a folder on a site, on a construction site, where there was no diving work being performed, and yet they were saying that the SWMS were specific to the site. Main contractors are not reviewing the content of subcontractor SWMS before work commences to ensure that they address the specific hazards of the construction project. And on-site employees are not receiving instruction and training in SWMS, and that's a really important one. And if we get just these few things across today, it's going to make carrying out your work health and safety functions a lot more streamlined and a lot easier. On-site employees are not reading SWMS before signing them. In a lot of cases, people just rock up to site, where's the folder, put their signature on, and away they go. And then that when a safe work inspector calls, if the work's not complying, the work's still being done, they're not stopping it. So the inspectors then stop it and say, okay, you're not working in conjunction with what you've agreed to do in this safe work method statement. This is just an example of what you can do now. You can buy packs of swims online. You can get them through Officeworks. This is another fairly major site. This one here, it might look a bit small depending on what size screen, but this is specific to the electrical industry. And it shows you that they've got a swim for just about everything. And what I'm going to go through today is to try and dispel that myth that you need a swim for everything and that you can really streamline your system. And as I've said there, the days of just buying packs, not reviewing them, not sort of talking to your employees about them are over if they ever really were in place. So before we get to the swims, I'm just going to go through some industry jargon because we need to understand a few terms around the industry. So first of all, I think we all know what a swim is, safe work method statement. Then there's SOPs. If you've heard the term SOPs, that's safe operating procedures, but it can also be called standard operating procedures. They can be for both safety-related things that aren't high-risk construction activities, as we'll talk about later, which is what swims relate to. But standard operating procedures can also include things like loading the photocopier with toner, or even how and where to save files on a network. The next one's a JSA. That's a job safety analysis. That's quite often confused with a swim. But it is a very different thing and is usually more applicable to areas that are not defined high-risk construction activities. Then we've got risk assessments and the term ALARP, as low as reasonably practicable. That's sort of changed in the legislation now. It used to be as low as reasonably possible, but practicable now brings into it the essence of that there has to be some practicality in the controls that you're using, which is good in a way for the industry. So in the master electrician system, we've got safe or standard operating procedures are contained in our field manual. This covers everything from using angle grinders, so things that carry a risk with it, through using drills, using power tools. They're things that do have an element of danger, but they're not deemed as high-risk construction activity, and as such, the regulators don't want to see safe work method statements on sites for them. So the procedures that allow people to work safely in all areas of the business that are not classified as high-risk construction activities and do not need a safe work method statement but still carry a level of risk. They can also provide further information on some aspects of high-risk construction activities, such as the condition you can work live, and that can be incorporated in the procedure so that as well as having the safe work method statement, people can get an understanding of when it is okay to work live. Risk assessment, it's a legal requirement to carry out risk assessments prior to carrying out live work, and strictly under the 4 conditions for carrying out live work. Even if you've done a risk assessment, you still require a safe work method statement to be available on site. The risk assessment is just about assessing the risks and determining whether or not that can go ahead. But the risk assessment is essentially just an assessment of the hazards and risks associated with a job, task or site. They can be used as a means for developing swims. So if you're doing work in a particular type of construction all the time, you could do a risk assessment which assesses all the risks in that area and then develop your swim as a result of the risk assessment. The overall process of risk identification, risk analysis and risk evaluation, that's the definition from the ISO guide. A job safety analysis is a procedure which helps integrate accepted safety and health principles and practices, and this is a definition straight out of standards, into a particular task or job operation. In a JSA, each basic step of the job is to identify potential hazards and to recommend the safest way to do the job. Other terms used to describe this procedure are JHA, job hazard breakdown, and the other one you'll probably see is a JSEA, which is a job safety and environmental analysis, and that's quite often a term that's used as well. Pre-start hazard assessment and control. This is probably one of the most important things that I want to go over today, and how that relates to SWMS and how it can really streamline how you manage your safety. So this is the frontline control for hazard identification and control prior to starting work. It's essential and it needs to be documented, and I can't stress that enough. If you are involved in a work site incident, this is one of the main documents that an inspector will ask for. They'll want to see how you identified and managed hazards. The electrical industry is fairly unique in that every time we go to another site, we have a new set of hazards that we have to assess and control. So it's essential that we have this pre-start done, and I'll go through that. It's not an overly onerous thing to do and doesn't take a lot of time. It should include equipment checks at least once each day, and should include a system for environmental checks and ongoing monitoring for changes, and it should show how hazards identified in the pre-start are controlled and how the controls are being used. Controls can include referencing SWMS. Now, this is probably one of the critical things that you don't need to write a SWM at a job site. In fact, you can't, and I'll talk about that again later, but you can reference them in this pre-start, which brings them into place. The JSA or risk assessment for additional controls not covered by the SWMS. So I'll go through the form that it's a very simple form today that will show how this all fits together. Definitions that we need to know: the meaning of construction project, which is clause 292. So a project, when a work health and safety person they're talking about a project that involves construction work where the cost is greater than $250,000. So that's a defined construction project, which in most cases is going to even include residential work. The meaning of a principal contractor. So the first one here basically says it's the person who commissions the construction project. That person can, under this second definition, also delegate that control to a project manager, in which case the project manager will be the head contractor for the purposes of who has to be given SWMS and who has to review them. And if it's the owner of residential premises, so if you're doing owner-builder work, it's you be the head contractor because you'll be engaging directly with them. There can only be one principal contractor at any specific time on a construction project, and this will all sort of make sense as we go through it. Now we need to know the meaning of construction work. So construction work means work carried out in connection with construction, alteration, conversion, fitting out, commissioning, renovation, repair, maintenance, refurbishment, demolition, decommissioning of a structure. Other items include any installation or testing carried out, which is fairly important with us. If we're testing switchboards, even if we're not modifying anything, we're still deemed to be carrying out construction work, and as such, these high-risk construction activities require the use of SWMS. Prefabrication or testing of elements, any work in connection with an excavation, preparatory site work. So all of those things get roped into this meaning of construction work. Now this is where I want to try and really clarify high-risk construction work, because these are what you need safe work method statements for, and they're very specific, and not all of them are technical trade. So this is where I've highlighted the ones that I've done in red are ones that we commonly come into contact with in the electrical trade. So the first one there is where you have the risk of a person falling more than 2 metres, 3 metres in South Australia. is carried out on a telecommunication tower. There are people in the electrical industry that work on that, and you do need a safe work method statement. You've got to monitor radiation exposure and so on. Involves demolition. We don't normally get in demolition of load bearing, and if you are doing demolition, it does require a high risk construction license. So be very careful if you are doing that. Involves or is likely to involve the disturbance of asbestos. That's another big one that electricians are involved in. Involves structural alterations or repairs that require temporary support to prevent collapse. If you're doing anything that you have to pull something out or do major, if you've got to get cables through a wall or a subfloor that you need to support, that needs a safe work method statement. Is carried out in or near a confined space. That's another one that's fairly common for us. Is carried out in or near a shaft or a trench with an excavated depth greater than 1.5 metres. It's pretty much waist height. You're in a high-risk construction activity. In a tunnel or involves the use of explosives, and I always say to people that includes explosive power tools. If you're using explosive power tools, there should be a safe work method statement to identify how that's going to be done and the hazards and risks associated with it and controls. Carried out on or pressurised gas distribution mains. A lot of electricians are unaware. It probably doesn't affect everybody, but if you're excavating towards a footpath where there's a gas distribution main, once you get within a metre of that, you're on or near. So you have to have a safe work method statement in place. And I can tell from personal experience, we actually hit a gas main doing a footpath excavation when I was doing level 2 work in New South Wales, and we were very thankful for having a safe work method statement in place when it came to being asked some serious questions. Carried out on or near chemical, fuel or refrigerant lines. There are areas if you're working in refineries, if you're working in large air conditioning installations. Carried out on or near energised electrical installations. That's the other big one that we do every day of the week. Is carried out in an area that may have a contaminated or flammable atmosphere. So if you do work in service stations, then you're going to have a SWIM that clearly identifies the risks and hazards associated with that, which will include zone 0 through to 1 and 2, and what procedures you need to have in place to do that. Tilt-up or precast concrete. If we're working on site while this is happening, we either need to be signed on to the SWIM of the construction company that are doing it, or we need to have our own safe work method statement. Carried out on or adjacent to a road, railway or shipping lane other than a traffic corridor that is used by traffic other than pedestrians. So if we're working beside the road, in close proximity to a road or traffic corridor, we should have a SWIM which will identify how we're going to control, whether it's barricades, traffic control or so on. Is carried out in an area or at a workplace where there is movement of powered mobile equipment or plant. Must have a SWIM for that, and it's very common if we're working around excavators, if you're working on a site with forklifts or movements, truck deliveries, then you must have a SWIM. Carried out in an area of artificial extremes of temperature. This sort of comes in probably more with refrigeration and some of the higher level refrigeration where you've got big chill, so it can be sub-zero temperatures. You have to have a safe work method statement for that. Carried out in or near water or liquid that involves a risk of drowning. If you're doing work on marinas, there should be a safe work method statement. That's another one that's been identified. And then the last one is that involves diving work. We don't normally get involved in that. So the red items there are probably some of the most common ones that we need to have a safe work method statement for. If you're involved in some of the others, if they strike a chord with you, then however many of these boxes you would tick red is the number of safe work methods, maximum number of safe work method statements that you would actually need to have. Legislation. So let's just go into the legislation. It's fairly uniform across Australia. High-risk construction work legislative requirements under Division 2. It says that a person conducting a business undertaking, carrying out high-risk construction work, must, before the construction work commences, have a safe work method statement prepared or prepared by another person. Safe work method statement must identify the work that's high risk, and I'll talk about that at the end when we go through the sample swim. Specify hazards relating to the high-risk construction work, describe the measures to be implemented to control the risk, and describe how the controls are to be implemented, monitored, and reviewed. So that's fairly important, that part of legislation. When are they required? Again, we've got these 18 areas, and whenever we're working in an area that involves those, we must have a safe work method statement available on site. So the PCBU must put in place arrangements for ensuring that the work is carried out in accordance with the safe work method statement, commonly referred to in work health and safety legislation as supervision. So that's what I was talking about earlier. We don't want guys on site where you have an isolation procedure that stipulates locks, and none of them have got a lock on when a safe work inspector arrives. You must ensure that all people using the swims are trained and have read the swims prior to starting work. Now, this seems to be a big job, but it's not. It's only got to be done once. So when you start an employee, if you've got 10 swims, you can give them some training on those swims, get them signed off on it, make sure that you're confident that they understand it, and then they can work on those swims all around the place. And if they know them really well, they don't necessarily even have to look at them, and a lot of guys don't. They just get used to working on it, but they have to be available there if they need to just review it because they're not sure. Work must stop if it's not being carried out in accordance with the swims, and resumed only in accordance with the swims. This is a really big one with the unions, particularly on big construction sites. They will go and look at swims. They'll come around and look at controls that are in place. And if you're using a swim that says edge protection and the edge protection is not up to standard, the union will call safe work and stop the job. And we've had prohibition issued against members for up to 7 days that they've stopped work on jobs. We've also had members who've been fined by fair trading after some of these things for breaches of licensing as well. Okay, if you do have a notifiable incident, that you've got to keep a copy of the applicable swims. So the swims that you're working under, you've got to keep that copy for 2 years. The 2-year figure is there because that is the investigation time that Safe Work have got to investigate and determine whether or not you've complied with the applicable legislation, and they can instigate a prosecution at any point in that 2 years. So yeah, it's fairly important to have these documents available. That's just another overview of the 18 high-risk activities, but note a swim is also required when working in the vicinity of exposed live parts, and this includes testing for de-energised. So there's master electricians have an isolate, tag and lockout swim, which covers for that. There's the Federal Safety Commissioner oversees a lot of larger construction sites and audits contractors who are going for government jobs, so fairly high-end jobs. This is really about what the Federal Safety Commissioner says about swims, what should be and what doesn't need to be included in them. So a swim is defined as an administrative control calling on higher order controls within the hierarchy. So we all know the hierarchy is elimination, substitution, engineering. Admin, this admin point here is where the swim fits in. So the idea of the swim is to identify higher order ways that that can reduce the risks to a level that's acceptable. Swims are not a step-by-step job procedure. The regulators now say they like to see them a maximum of 7 to 10 pages, because they understand that most people cannot comprehend in a work environment more than about 7 to 10 pages of documents when they're reviewing them and putting controls in place. I know of a case where a contractor received an improvement notice because of a 39-page swim, and Safe Work just said that there is no way in the world that your guys can even tell me what's in that swim. I know it, and so they gave them an improvement notice. So they're effectively an overview of the hazards, the risks associated with the hazard, and the control measures developed by the organisation in conjunction with them. And this is where it's fairly important, which I'll talk about later, why you can't just develop a swim on the fly. So this is what the Federal Safety Commissioner has got to say. This is a document that they put out, which says that the swims must be specific to the works undertaken or the project. Generic swims can be used. If a hazard exists or is likely to exist on a site, it will be in a generic swim, and they definitely are in our generic swims. So you don't need to rewrite them all the time to fit a particular site. The main thing that they need is on construction projects, which are over $250,000, where there is a head contractor, they must be specific to the site. In other cases where you're doing service work, moving around a lot and doing a lot of jobs, they can be generic swims, and they can just say that they apply to all sites and all work. Swims must identify the specific hazards. It goes without saying. Define control measures must eliminate. Again, that's that hierarchy of control, or minimise each of the risks. Controls must be in accordance with the relevant requirements from legislation. That can be, so when working at heights, for example, the controls have got to be one of the defined legislative requirements. So either edge protection, positioning, or fall arrest. That's what that talks about. And they must take into account on construction jobs. So this is over $250,000. They must take into account the WHS management plan and associate requirements of the principal contractor, including the incorporation of relevant project-specific requirements. Okay, the next one, the development requirements, and this is the important one, and this is why you can't develop them on the fly, and they can't be developed by an individual arriving at a job site. That's where the JSA comes in. So where you're doing high-risk construction activities, you've got to have these swims pre-prepared and approved by management. So they must be developed in consultation with workers conducting the activity or their representatives. So on large companies, you may have a work health and safety representative who represents a body of workers, and they can be developed in conjunction with that person, who will report back and collect the information from the body of workers that they represent. They must be reviewed by the principal contractor before work activity commences, and any issues must be rectified prior to commencement. Workers must be provided with information, training and instruction. So this is the primary thing. If you've got a generic set of swims that you're using for your day-to-day work, you can still use them on a construction site, and that is the best way to do it, because you only have to induct your employees onto those swims the once, and then review them periodically, or if they haven't worked under them for a long time. Work must be completed in accordance with the swims, and the principal contractor must have a system to monitor compliance with the swims, and that system may be putting that on you and ensuring that you're supervising the work. The swims must be reviewed when controls are potentially not effective. So if you have an incident, the regulations, and in, I think, most states it comes under under regulation 38, I think it is, that says if you have a failure to control a hazard on a site or a near miss, you need to review the swim to determine whether didn't adequately control it, or whether it was elements outside the swim that somebody perhaps wasn't working to the procedures, or that one of the controls hadn't been implemented. Lucky last is what is not required in the swims, and this is a contentious point. It comes up regularly with our members. Lists of legislations and legislative references within swims are not required. I will require it, and unfortunately it's an argument that you can't win. If they require it, it needs to be in there. And when we go through the Master Electrician swim at the end, I'll show how we've dealt with that. My preference is to leave it out as far as possible, because if you list a whole heap of Australian standards and you do have an incident, it provides a lot of fodder for a legal representative to prosecute you on, that you may or may not have access to those standards and may not be completely familiar with them. So simpler is better. So complete codes, sections from codes of practice shouldn't be put in them. Swims for activities, and this is important, swims for activities not defined as high-risk construction work, as per the jurisdictional WHS Act or regulations, are not required. And it's not only these days that they're not required. Safe Work don't want to sue them, because they really do believe that they're confusing the issue, where people don't know the difference between a high-risk construction activity and an activity. High-risk construction activities are statistically the activities that cause major harm or fatalities. So while using an angle grinder may be quite a dangerous thing, it's not a high-risk construction activity. But if you're using it to cut tiles, it's part of a high-risk construction activity. So the controls in place are designed around the heights rather than the use of the angle grinder, and that's what the swim should revolve around. Okay, why do we need swims? So Section 19 of the Act, and if you ever read through prosecutions and go on any of the various state websites about successful prosecutions, you'll see a lot of them are prosecuted under a failure of Section 19, primary duty of care of an employer. And this point C here, the provision of and maintenance of safe systems of work, that is directly having safe work statements for the high-risk construction activities. And the other one is provision of information, training, instruction, or supervision that is necessary to protect all persons from risks to their health and safety arising from the work carried out. So when people are working under a swim, periodically, for a smaller contractor, it may only be once every 3 months, but every so often we should do an audit of our workplace, make sure that if we've referenced swims in our pre-start, that we've got all of the controls in place, and that we haven't just got people working however they want. That's part of the SIM requirement, and this particular Section 19 is often what you'll see the prosecutions arising from. So basic steps for managing WHS. So this is a basic system that's keep you compliant. It's going to make it a lot easier for you to manage. I'm not talking about a system that can be audited against the Australian Standard 4801 or ISO 45001. They are extremely complex documents and really only applicable to very large scale operations, oil refineries, oil platforms, large operations, mining, and so on, and very large tier construction. So what we're going to cover here today is a system that's designed at simplifying what you actually need to do. So step one, have all the key elements in place. So you need policies, procedures, you need safe work method statements for any of the high-risk construction activities you engage in, safety data sheets for any chemicals that you use. You need some forms and some feedback tools so that information can come from the field back to you and allow you to monitor it. You need risk assessments for hazards applicable to your business. In most cases, if you're using our swims, those risk assessments are done, and the swims have most of the controls in that you're going to need. You just need to review and make sure that they're appropriate to your business. You need some supervisory tools and record keeping, including where you keep licenses and competencies, that you've got a means of tracking them, that they're current. So that's your first aid, your electrician's licenses, even your driver's licenses, and you also need to just record some training records. So if you've given someone an induction, you've gone through the swims that are applicable to your business. The records will be that they sign off on the safe work method statements, and you then keep that, and you then provide them with copies of those swims to work under. And then some procedures for continuous improvement and review. We should try to improve and review, get feedback from our employees periodically. So this is these are the steps to a very basic safety system. So all safety systems are founded on policies. This is effectively the rules that you want your employees to abide by. And I'm going to stick here to the policies that are primarily related around safety. So company policies form the basis of expected behaviour in all staff in safety and other aspects of the business. As a minimum, you must have a work health and safety policy and a rehabilitation policy. These days, it's not that easy. You need to have a lot more policies, but they are the minimum. You need to have some drug and alcohol policies and a few other things in place these days if you employ people. The other thing that company policies do, they empower your employees. So if the employee knows what your rules are, rules of engagement with your customers, if a customer says to a young employee who's unsure of himself, you can do that live, I'm not turning the power off, and he's confident that that you're going to back him up with that company policy, he will say, look, I'm sorry, we're going to have to arrange to come back after hours, because he'll feel confident in representing your business in accordance with the policies that you've given him. The next part is the safe operating procedures, and this is our field manual. So a set of safe operating procedures for risks that are not part of the high risk construction activities. And that we've got 108 pages in our manual. It covers virtually every aspect of electrical work. Swims, so this is your 18 areas. So you need swims for whatever areas you are working in that are under those 18 high risk ones, and you also need one which includes isolation testing as an extra. That's just an extra that we need as the electrical industry. Workers must also receive adequate information, training and instruction on the applicable swims, including how to assess risk themselves. You need some forms. They're the active documents, and in most cases, if you have an incident and you are under investigation, it won't be 1 and 2 that Safe Work will be looking at. They will be looking at your swims. They will be looking at these active documents forms, that what you're generating out of the field, your pre-start risk assessments, and then they'll be looking at the active forms for your supervision, how you knew that worker was competent, how you knew they were following the swims. And so some basic forms allow you to do that without it being a serious financial burden, even really all on your business once it's systemized. In our system, these are the policies that you get as a master electrician. This is our basic membership. You get all of these policies on the left-hand side here. Number 2, you get our field manual, which is 108 pages. You get 10 safe work method statements, which are all listed there. You get a risk assessment app, which you can use, or you can use a paper-based form if you like. So we actually have an app that allows you to do risk assessments and pre-starts and records them all for you on the fly. You need some additional forms for consultation and improvement, which this app also does. It allows you to do ladder inspections, equipment inspections, and if your safety system is working, which is what the expectation is, everything that's documented in a safety system is really just documenting a procedure that you're going to follow to make sure that your guys are working safely and that you're giving them the right information and training to make the right decisions. So these are the things that your safety system should be producing if it's working. And then you also need to be able to verify some supervision. So that's, like I said, just supervising, watching the guys on jobs. There's no legislative requirement that it has to be done daily. It can be done, once a month, once a quarter. But as long as you've got something that's a business and the level of activity, you're pretty well covered in that. Okay, step 2, providing training to employees on all system documents. Ensure that they're aware of the importance and have signed copies of your policies and your safe work method statements and your field manual. Ensure that employees are using the feedback tools. Make sure that you're getting the pre-starts done of the day. Make sure that you're getting them back. So I've an incident investigation where Safe Work issued a 155 notice, which is a request for information, and they wanted all of the pre-starts for the 23 days leading up to the incident. And you can get away with maybe not having one or two, but if when they ask you for that, you cannot produce 21 out of the 23 days, they will say you have a systemic failure in your safety management system, and you've failed in your duty as an employer to provide a safe system of work under that section 19, and that's where the prosecution. Okay, step 3, supervision. Ensure that all employees are conducting daily pre-starts, assessing hazards prior to every job, that they've been inducted and trained. That's only got to be the once. They don't have to be inducted and trained. You can run some toolbox talks for some extra safety topics. They're the types of things that keep safety in the front of people's minds, thinking about not taking risks while they're working for an employer and putting themselves, their workmates, and the company they work for at risk. Formally review systems and components at appropriate intervals. SWIMs are normally reviewed once a year, or if there's been a failure to control. And then get feedback from employees on what works and what doesn't. That's consultation. So you can have an employee every so often, if he's going to be doing a job and he's working on or near, you can give him the on or near swim and say, I want you to just work to this and pencil in anything that we can improve. Keep those as documents, and that's records that you're consulting with your employees, and it's part of your normal workflow. Okay, the daily pre-start. I can't emphasize enough how important this is, and it's probably the main thing that I come across that it's not being done that is putting companies in jeopardy. So, as I said, we have an app. This document here is a paper-based one, and I'm happy to forward this. If you shoot your email address in, I'm happy to forward this out to anyone. So effectively, we'll go up the top here. We start with the date, the vehicle. That can be 1 or 2 employees, and then they initial it. We do a daily equipment pre-use inspection. Vehicle, ladders, we don't get them all out and look at them before we start. We do this as we're working. We go through and make sure that as we're working, everything that we're using, that we can say, yes, rescue kit's available, and yes, we're trained and competent to do this job. The second part's site environmental and access, and you'll see every hazard in this environmental has an A1 through to A9, and our controls are labelled B1 through to B9. We then have the section for all of the high-risk construction activities. So to do this daily pre-start, we arrive on the job number in, oops, sorry, I've just gone one, we're back there. We write the job number in down here, client name, and so this particular one incorporates start and finish times, and that way people use it as a timesheet, which means you will get it back at the end of the day. This one you can do multiple jobs up to in a day. Now, when we're doing our hazard identification, if we had noise and dust, we would write A2 down here in the hazard, and our control would be B2. PE, acoustic isolation or ventilation, we would write B2 over here in the control. If we were working at heights on this job, we would write H1 in the hazard ID number here, and then our control would be SWMS 1, and that would be working at heights. And that's it. We're done. We've identified the hazards and we've referenced our controls. Let's say, for example, there's something there that's not covered in the swim, and we then still have the ability to do what's the equivalent of a JSA. We put the same job number down here. The hazard might be redback spider nest under the switchboard. The initial risk is high. The control is spray, aerosol, and the residual risk then becomes low. We've then identified everything and we're ready to start work. That, in a lot of cases, is going to take less than a minute or two. It's a very, very, very quick way to do it. So whether you're doing it on a paper-based system like this, or on an app, on our phone app, as long as it's being done, that's the important part. And again, we don't have to get to the site. We've just got to have the high-risk swims available on site so that they can be needed. And I'll talk about that and how we can do that later. Okay, so this is where we say swims have to be readily available. So swims must be readily available to your workers wherever they are working. Now, the requirements are left up to the PCBU. So the owner of the business really is the person who you're going to deliver those swims. They could be paper versions in a folder in the vehicle. There's some real benefits of that, but the disadvantage is that sometimes they get taken out, they don't get put back in, and if you have a number of vehicles, if you modify one in 12 months' time and review it based on some feedback that you've had, you've got to go through and update all the vehicles with a paper-based copy. They can be available on a tablet. A lot of people are using iPads these days, so that they can be available on a tablet electronically, on a folder left at the construction site. That's a very common way for large projects where people have a shed on the construction site, and there's a sign-on, sign-off sheet, toolbox talks, and all the swims are kept in the folder. Similar thing, they do get taken and sometimes not put back, so that's another issue. Electrically, via on a phone, if you can have them in Dropbox, you can have them on a Google Drive, you can have them on OneDrive. There's nothing in the legislation that restricts you from how you want to provide these to your workers. The only thing that I will note is that if you're using electronic means, try and make sure that they're not reliant on having an internet service. If you guys are working in an area where there's no service, and they do have an incident or they do have an inspector call and the swims aren't available, it can lead to an on-the-spot fine. So have them downloaded, get them to make the Dropbox folder available offline, and you're good to go. Okay, a couple of FAQs that I get from our members. Does a worker prepare a swims for the site when they arrive to start work? Short answer is no. Swims have got to be prepared in consultation with work, approved by management. They're a document, they're more of a static document than an active document, and the workers must be giving training and instruction which must be recorded to determine their competency to work under that swim. So you can't prepare a swim on the fly and say, I've got a safe work method statement. You can't comply with the requirements of the legislation under this to do that. So they've got to be prepared once and then used many times. And this is how you start to have a system that all you're needing to do is reference the swims as a control. How many swims do I need? You need a swim for each high-risk construction activity that your workers may face in their daily schedule. For many electrical contractors, 10 swims covers the scope of their work. there's still nothing stopping you. So there's two ways that you could do it. You can reference swims. For example, if you are working at heights and working on or near on a job, you reference the two swims as your controls. But if you are doing a job that is the same all the time, if it was installing electric roller doors, and that's all you did in your company, you could have one swim that addressed the specific high-risk construction activities that you dealt with in installing roller doors, and you could get away with one swim that you just have to reference. You just have to be very careful that that swim covers every possible combination that you guys can face, and that's where having the 10 and reference more than one is often better. My work is repetitive. Can I have one swim? Yes, that's what I was just talking about. Provided it covers all the high-risk construction activities and can be implemented on all sites and conditions that you're likely to encounter. Is referencing multiple swims in the pre-start an acceptable way to control high-risk construction activity? Absolutely, but the swims have to be available in whatever form you determine that you want to provide them to your employees. They just have to be readily accessible when an inspector calls or when an employee needs to review them because they haven't worked under one for a while and they just want to check that they've got everything okay. And that's why simplifying swims, keeping them short so that they can be scanned very quickly, that I've got all of the appropriate hazards identified and all the appropriate controls in place. Okay, this is a sample of the Master Electrician's Safe Work Method Statement. So this is just a couple of cut and pastes I've done out of ours. This one is for asbestos. It gives you a place to put project title and project address. Now, as I said, if you are working on multiple sites in a day, sites and that covers it. If it's a construction project over $250,000, it has to address the title and the project address. So that's where you would then need to take those same set of swims. They can still be the generics and add the details of the address. Company name, supervising site worker, that can be all workers inducted on this swims or signed onto this swims, or it can be a list of workers who are working on a construction site together. Personnel consultant in development, if you're a single operator, that can be one person, it can be two people, it can be as many as you feel you need, provided that you can demonstrate that you're getting the required level of knowledge of the hazards associated with the job. It's got the high risk work identified, demolition, excavation, trenching, hazardous substances, heights. So we tick those boxes in the swim. It's got a way of determining risk. Now the way master electricians use their risk matrix is that we have a likelihood and each of them has a 4. So if something is likely to happen, it's a 4. And if it's a moderate consequence, it's a 3. So we multiply those together to get a 12. And then you'll see here we have, if the residual risk is 1 to 3, work can proceed, it's insignificant, permission from worker in charge, permission from high-level management. So if one of the controls on the swim has then been risk assessed that it's not going to work and you're in the 10 to 15 range, as a business owner, you want to know about it before someone starts to proceed. There have been so many fatalities where people have gone, it should be okay, and not stopped work and said, look, I want some more advice on this. How can we control this? So that's our risk matrix. We then have, and this is just the start of it, planning pre-start, unidentified asbestos, likelihood in a lot of commercial buildings, 3, yep. Consequences 4, result 12. We put the controls in place here. We obtain a copy of the asbestos register, and that makes the likelihood 2, which gives us 4, which means that we can start at any point. And the person responsible can be the project manager on large jobs, or all staff, or tradesman in charge if it's an apprentice. This is where I was saying some companies still require the legislation. So what we've done is put our legislation on our last page. You can leave it out, and that way it's not brought into any proceedings. It's not required by the Federal Safety Commissioner. but some builders require it. So if they require it, you leave it in there. If they don't require it, you can take it out, and it's not going to affect the validity of the swim in any way. And then the last page, once you've inducted the worker on the swim, you get their name, signature, the date, and this gives you the opportunity for all your workers to be signed onto a common set of swims in the office, and those in the office and duplicates of those swims controlled are given to your workers by whatever means you deem satisfactory. So I hope that's covered it today. If you've got any questions, I'm going to email. You can shoot your email address into the chat section there, and I'll make sure that you get an email, a PDF version of this, and the a sample of the documents that that I've referenced. So I'll just have a look if there's any questions. We've gone a bit over time, but I hope that you've all got something out of it. Thanks, Tam.